Reflections, Soul Trader, Part 2. Excerpts from Soul Trader, Identity in a Digital Age by Mary Harrington. 3 technology transitions define our era. As we will see, all 3 represent radical and transformative applications of technology to the human soul. But while this revelation may sound alarming, in truth, it exists in continuity with a far longer civilizational trajectory. For our shared and nested surroundings of human consciousness and of reality have always interlocked with our information technologies. More plainly, this is not our first singularity event. The long arc of Western culture tracks a slowly evolving view of our inner lives that developed in tandem with beliefs about the nature of reality and the divine. And this evolution has always been both shaped and transmitted by our information technologies. Of these, reading and writing was always the technology most profoundly linked to the soul. In particular, as Walter Ong describes, literacy appears to be the critical catalyst for a sense of having inner lives, whose activity and topography is distinct from our engagement with the world around us. The historian Adam Garfinkel argues that what Karl Jaspers called the axial age within classical antiquity emerges downstream of the spread of deep literacy in a still small but critical share of the population, and with it, of a new sense of interiority. The first recorded reference to the soul, psyche, in the Western tradition appears in Plato, one of the most profoundly influential philosophers of the axial age. For Plato, and later in modified form Aristotle, the soul was understood as having 3 parts. Plato sets out his 3-part understanding of the soul in Book 4 of the Republic: appetite, spirit, and reason. The first of these, eros, concerns urges and desires such as food and sex. The second, thumos, concerns spirit, courage, passion, and the drive for recognition. The third, logos, Plato situates in the head. Its role is governance of the whole, oriented toward comprehension of the divine order as expressed in the world. And this divine order reflects a crucial corollary. From these earliest conceptions of the soul, it is clear that such self-reflection cannot be separated from how we understand the rest of reality. For both Plato and Aristotle, to be rational as such did not connote, as it does for moderns, an emotional detachment. Rather, rationality, as expressed by logos, denotes a capacity to discern and order one's life and behavior to rationality at the cosmic scale. This intuitive sense of an inextricable, ordered, and transcendent correspondence between what we are as souls, what and how we perceive, and what the world is at the most fundamental level is characterized by the historian Charles Taylor as ontic logos, an experience of reality in which mind and world cannot be disentangled. And it is clear that these earliest Western theories of the soul, themselves inextricable from theories of reality, are both profoundly tied to the capacity for deep reading, in whose wake they became possible. Seen thus, we might argue that the entire history of Western civilization follows from this first singularity. Though a brief video cannot do justice to the detail, there existed considerable continuity between Plato's divine order and the version of ontic logos, discernible in influential early Christian thinkers. Where Plato posited a world of forms, for example, St. Augustine reconceived these as ideas in the mind of God. Importantly, though, Christianity brought an inward turn, as Charles Taylor shows, while St. Augustine retained the ontic logos, the suffusion of divinity in nature. Orientation toward the divine was now understood to be achieved via the discovery of God within the soul, aided by divine grace. This crucial inward turn would have momentous consequences over time, as would the Christian emphasis on divine and human freedom. From the perspective of these interlocking views of the soul and the world, one of the most seismic inflection points is that story came in the 13th century AD, with William of Ockham's challenge to the ontic logos. For this 13th century Franciscan friar, such a static order implied constraints on God's freedom to act in history. How could it be the case that God's divine freedom might be constrained by the limits of God's own created order? Occam argued that since it could not be proved that pre-existing divine templates existed for forms in nature, such entities could not be assumed to exist. Downstream of this challenge, the immanent and self-evident nature of the divine order came increasingly into question. In turn, as the world's orderliness grew less self-evident, so individual human freedom to act upon that world came also to seem not just legitimate, but morally right, in order to grasp the fullness of God's creation and realize its potential for good. In this context, the first proto-scientific inquiries began, and the pace of mechanical innovation slowly to increase. Of these innovations, Gutenberg's movable type was to prove the most shattering of all. Moving from hand-lettered to printed books accelerated their production, which widened access to the sole technology of literacy. And with this change, all the cognitive transformations associated with literacy also began to spread, including the experience of interiority. Public willingness to rely on clerical authority for spiritual guidance waned. Central to the Protestant Reformation that followed, bringing political, religious, and intellectual convulsions in its wake, was a new relationship between individual souls and the divine, one less mediated by liturgy or religious authority, but rather as between God and individual readers of Scripture. In turn, wherever Protestantism took hold, so too in literacy followed, often via state-mandated education. And, inevitably, as the relation between individual believers and the divine shed its previous anchors in ontic logos and social or liturgical mediation, so too the relation between soul and world also transformed. The modern era that has followed in the wake of this revolution could not have flourished without, as Ong describes it, this distinctly Protestant-flavored literacy. A world dominated by writing, with its drive toward carefully itemized introspection and elaborately worked-out analyses of inner states of soul and of their inwardly structured sequential relationships. In very reductive summary, the printing press both arose from, and in turn accelerated, a transformation in thinking derived from Occam's war on the notion of divine forms, a nominalist revolution. In time, this shift would deliver a radically new perspective on the natural world, as well as a new kind of soul, the increasingly secular self. Francis Bacon was a pioneer of this modern formulation. In Novum Organum, 1620, where he detailed a new method of inductive reasoning that, he argued, was superior to the scholastic method of reasoning by syllogism, and that would allow us to force nature to give up her secrets. The violence of the analogy, Bacon speaks of putting nature to the question, which is to say, torture, is a far cry from the sense of ambient divinity expressed by the ontic logos. Not long after, René Descartes would write Discourse on the Method, 1637, in which he dismissed that speculative philosophy which is taught in the schools in favor of a practical philosophy that will convey knowledge of the natural, external world as distinctively as we know the different crafts of our artisans. Thus, Descartes reasoned we could employ discoveries usefully to our own benefit, and thus render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. As Taylor puts it, this emerging consensus on human selfhood presupposed the utter separation of mind from a mechanistic universe of matter, understood as most emphatically not a medium of thought, but rather expressively dead. Beyond us, this expressively dead world is hypothesized as entirely knowable via the scientific method. In other words, as enchantment drained from the world with modernity, the inner, perceiving self would take on ever greater centrality. In a world ever more bare of God's presence, it follows that value and meaning can only come from within. Meanwhile, that which lay beyond our minds was now understood as inert and mechanistic, awaiting our study and mastery. Within the secular modern world that developed in the wake of the resulting scientific advancements, God came increasingly to be understood as superfluous or even as an obstacle to further advancements. Though Bacon and Descartes were Christians, they anticipated how, in order to be a legitimate object for scientific study, the world must be purged of divine aura. In their wake, God thus retreated by stages, first to the remote status of divine clockmaker, as in William Paley's 1802 formulation, and, over time, to a kind of tolerated status as optional extra. In this context, it has grown increasingly difficult to speak of souls, with the spiritual presuppositions this term would imply. And yet that something persists that does the perceiving, thinking, understanding, and innovating, only now it is more commonly referred to not as the soul, but its secularized analog, the self. All that is distinctive about modernity is held in this formulation for the relation between ourselves and the reality we inhabit. On the one hand, a radically subjective inner self capable of thought, but not necessarily spiritual in nature, and on the other, an inert, comprehensible, mechanistic outer world ordered to our instrumental mastery. Out of this, and out of reactions to it, came high European culture, industrial modernity, the scramble for empire, and much else that is commonly gestured at when we use the phrase Western civilization today. At its core lies the postulate of an inert external world, fundamentally predictable and mechanistic in nature, ultimately intelligible to and predictable within the laws of physics, and amenable to instrumental management by a disengaged, rational, but also radically subjective self. This model of self and reality has, since the two world wars, seemingly given way to the postmodern construct of identity. But it is a mistake to think of that segue as the next stage of our civilizational evolution after modernity. Rather, it represents modernity's last stand against the germ of an intellectual and metaphysical revolution which emerged from the bosom of science itself more than a century ago. This revolution that has proved so indigestible since that we have spent the ensuing decades doing everything in our power to avoid its implications, including attempting to become our own machines.